The desert wind carried secrets across the dunes of Al Ain, where sand stretched endlessly toward mountains that marked the border between the United Arab Emirates and Oman. In the exclusive residential compound of Al Toya, where palatial villas rose like fortresses behind high walls, the morning call to prayer echoed from nearby mosques, while gardeners tended to lawns that shouldn't exist in this climate. Each blade of grass a testament to wealth that could bend nature itself to human will. Inside Villa 47, a home worth 15 million dirhams with marble imported from Carrara and chandeliers from Venice, 28-year-old Maria Santos woke at 5:00 a.m. to prepare her husband's breakfast, her hands trembling as they had every morning since he'd asked the question that shattered her carefully constructed new life. "Were you married before?" Sheikh Khalid bin Abdullah al-Mazroui had asked 3 days ago, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to absolute truth. Maria had lied as she'd lied throughout their courtship, as she'd lied on every document that brought her from Manila to this golden prison. "No, Habibi," she'd whispered, "you are my first and only husband." But Khalid had already hired investigators. The truth was coming. And in 48 hours, Maria would be found half buried in desert sand, clinging to life, while the man who'd promised to cherish her had ordered her execution for the sin of dishonesty. This is the story of how desperation, deception, and obsession with honor converge in tragedy. Maria Elena Santos entered the world on June 3, 1989, in Tondo, Manila, one of the most densely populated and impoverished neighborhoods in the Philippines, where hope was a luxury few could afford and survival required daily miracles. Her father, Eduardo Santos, worked as a jeepney driver, navigating Manila's chaotic traffic 14 hours daily for earnings that barely covered rice and rent for their single-room dwelling in a compound housing 8 families sharing one bathroom. Her mother, Teresa, took laundry and ironing from wealthier neighborhoods, her hands perpetually reddened from detergent, and her back bent from carrying heavy loads. Maria was the eldest of 6 children, each representing another mouth to feed in a household where poverty wasn't just economic condition but generational inheritance. Her childhood was defined by lack of space in their cramped room, lack of food beyond rice and dried fish, lack of new clothes or school supplies, and lack of any apparent path out of circumstances that seemed designed to reproduce themselves indefinitely. She slept on a mat on the floor with 3 younger siblings, attended an overcrowded public school where 50 students shared broken desks, and spent afternoons helping her mother with laundry or watching her younger siblings while her parents worked. But Maria possessed 2 qualities that distinguished her from neighbors who'd accepted poverty as permanent condition. She was strikingly beautiful, with the kind of delicate features that drew attention even in childhood, and she was absolutely determined to escape Tondo by any means necessary. While other children played in the narrow alleys, Maria studied by candlelight when electricity was cut, teaching herself English from discarded magazines and practicing her speech until her accent softened into something that might pass for educated rather than street-raised. At 16, Maria dropped out of high school to work at a call center in Makati, lying about her age and education to secure a position that paid 12,000 pesos monthly, poverty wages by global standards, but double what her father earned driving his jeepney. She sent 8,000 home to her family, used 3,000 for her share of a crowded boarding house room with 5 other call center workers, and saved the remainder with religious discipline. Her plan was simple: accumulate enough money for college, earn a degree, secure a professional position, and lift her family from the poverty that had defined 3 generations. The plan lasted 18 months before Carlos Reyes entered her life and destroyed everything. Maria met Carlos in 2007 when she was 18 and he was 23, a customer service supervisor at the call center where she worked. He was handsome in the way that made young girls ignore warning signs, smooth-talking, generous with compliments, and attentive in ways that made Maria feel special rather than invisible. He pursued her with gifts she couldn't afford to refuse, meals at restaurants she'd only seen from outside, new clothes that made her feel less ashamed of her background, and most intoxicating, validation that someone from a better background saw value in a girl from Tondo. Their romance progressed quickly, accelerated by Maria's inexperience and Carlos's practiced manipulation. He spoke of their future together, of how he'd take care of her, of how love was more important than her family's objections to their relationship. When Maria became pregnant 6 months into their relationship, Carlos's response seemed to confirm his commitment. He proposed marriage, presenting a simple ring and promises that they'd build a life together despite their young ages. They married at Manila City Hall in February 2008, a civil ceremony attended by 2 witnesses pulled from the hallway because Carlos claimed his family was too traditional to accept the rushed wedding. Maria was 3 months pregnant, 18 years old, and convinced that love and determination would be enough to overcome any obstacle. Her family, though disappointed she'd abandoned her education and savings for a hasty marriage, hoped Carlos would provide the stability their daughter deserved. The marriage revealed its true nature within weeks. Carlos was controlling, jealous, and violent when drinking, which was increasingly frequent. The small apartment he'd promised became a single room in his mother's house, where Maria was treated as unwelcome burden rather than daughter-in-law. The good job that was supposed to support them disappeared after Carlos was fired for attendance issues he blamed on everyone but himself. His promises of being a provider evaporated as Maria found herself working at a garment factory while pregnant, her earnings supporting Carlos's drinking and his mother's household expenses. Their daughter, Isabella, was born in September 2008. Maria loved her instantly and desperately, seeing in her tiny face both hope for the future and terror about how she'd provide for this child. Carlos showed minimal interest in fatherhood, viewing the baby as another burden rather than a blessing. His violence escalated after Isabella's birth. Slaps became punches, verbal abuse became daily routine, and Maria found herself trapped in circumstances worse than the poverty she'd tried to escape. The breaking point came in March 2010, when Isabella was 18 months old and Carlos came home drunk, enraged about some perceived slight. In front of his daughter, he beat Maria so severely she required hospitalization for broken ribs and facial injuries. The police report filed by hospital social workers documented the abuse, but Carlos's family used connections to ensure no charges were filed. Instead, they presented Maria with an ultimatum: leave their home and their son, abandon any claim to marriage or support, and disappear from their lives, or face accusations of being an unfit mother, and lose custody of Isabella entirely. Maria, broken physically and psychologically, was given 24 hours to decide. She understood that fighting families with connections and money, while she had neither, would result in losing her daughter through a legal system that favored wealth over justice. So she made the most painful decision of her life. She fled with Isabella in the middle of the night, leaving behind the marriage, her belongings, and any official acknowledgement that the relationship had existed. For the next 3 years, Maria lived in hiding in Quezon City, working multiple jobs under her maiden name, supporting Isabella and sending small amounts to her family while avoiding any official documentation that might alert Carlos's family to her location. She worked as a housemaid, a market vendor, a restaurant server, any job that paid cash and asked no questions about her past. She never filed for official divorce because the process required money she didn't have and would expose her location to people she feared. By 2013, Isabella was 5 years old, starting school, and asking questions about her father that Maria deflected with vague stories about him working far away. Maria was 24, exhausted from years of survival mode, and desperate for a solution that would provide real security for her daughter. When a recruitment agency advertised positions for domestic workers and caregivers in the UAE, Maria saw an opportunity. Not ideal, but better than the precarious existence she'd been managing. The decision to pursue UAE employment meant confronting an uncomfortable truth. She was technically still married to Carlos, though they'd had no contact for 3 years. Divorce in the Philippines required expensive legal processes, court appearances, and documentation she couldn't provide without exposing herself to the family she'd fled. The recruitment agency made clear that UAE employers, particularly Muslim families, strongly preferred single women without complicated backgrounds. Married women were seen as potential visa risks, likely to bring family complications or abandon positions to reunite with husbands. Maria made the calculated decision to omit her marriage from all documentation. She applied as Maria Elena Santos, single mother, widowed, creating a story about a boyfriend who died in an accident before they could marry. It was a lie, but one that felt justified by circumstances beyond her control. She needed this opportunity. Isabella needed stability, and a marriage that had ended in violence and abandonment felt less real than the fiction she was creating. The processing took 8 months and cost 180,000 pesos borrowed from loan sharks at predatory rates. Medical exams, police clearances, training programs, agency fees. Each step represented debt that would take years to repay. But in November 2013, Maria boarded an Emirates flight to Abu Dhabi, leaving 4-year-old Isabella with her parents in Tondo, carrying 2 suitcases and a lie that would eventually threaten both their lives. Sheikh Khalid bin Abdullah al-Mazroui represented the 4th generation of a family that had transformed from pearl-diving Bedouins into oil-enriched power brokers, who shaped UAE policy and controlled assets worth hundreds of millions. Born in 1980 to a prominent Al Ain family with direct connections to the ruling Al Nahyan clan, Khalid had grown up in a world where wealth was assumed, power was inherited, and honor was the currency that mattered more than money. His education followed the pattern of Gulf elite: elementary years at exclusive private academies in Abu Dhabi, secondary education at boarding schools in Switzerland, and university at the American University of Sharjah studying business administration, more for the credential than any actual career necessity. His professional life was nominal. He held titles at family companies managing real estate developments and investment portfolios, but actual work was handled by hired experts, while Khalid attended occasional meetings and approved decisions made by others. At 37, Khalid embodied the contradictions of modern Gulf wealth, traditionally minded about religion, family, and honor, yet driving imported sports cars, traveling extensively to Europe, and maintaining the kind of materially comfortable lifestyle that his grandfather would have found incomprehensible. He prayed 5 times daily, observed Ramadan strictly, and could recite Quranic verses from memory. He also owned a collection of luxury watches worth more than most people earned in lifetimes, maintained multiple properties across the Emirates, and employed a staff of 16 servants to manage his household. His first marriage, arranged when he was 23 to his cousin Fatima, had produced 3 children but little companionship. Fatima was a good Muslim wife, obedient, focused on home and children, appropriate for his social position, but their relationship was dutiful rather than affectionate. They maintained separate wings of the family compound, came together for family obligations and occasional conjugal visits, and lived essentially parallel lives that intersected minimally. Emirati law permitted him up to 4 wives simultaneously, a provision Khalid had considered but never acted upon until 2016, when restlessness and the example of friends taking foreign brides planted ideas about adding a second wife to his household. Foreign brides, particularly from Southeast Asia, had become increasingly popular among wealthy Gulf men seeking women who were beautiful, grateful for the opportunity, and less demanding than local women who knew their rights and had powerful families to advocate for them. Maria entered Khalid's household in December 2013 as a domestic worker, one of 6 Filipino staff members managing the daily operations of his villa. Her initial duties were mundane, cleaning, laundry, occasional cooking assistance, but her beauty was impossible not to notice. At 24, Maria possessed the kind of delicate loveliness that photographs failed to capture. Expressive dark eyes, graceful movements, and a gentle demeanor that made her seem refined despite her working-class background. For the first year, their interactions were minimal and appropriate. Khalid barely acknowledged domestic staff beyond occasional instructions, viewing them as functional elements of household operations rather than individuals. Maria kept her head down, worked diligently, and sent her modest salary home to support Isabella and her parents. She lived in the servants' quarters with other Filipino staff. Her free time spent video calling her daughter and counting the months until she'd saved enough to perhaps start a small business back home. The shift began in early 2015, when Khalid's mother noticed Maria's competence and recommended promoting her to personal assistant for his first wife, Fatima, a position requiring more interaction with the family and command of English that Maria had perfected. The new role brought Maria into closer contact with Khalid during family dinners, social events, and occasions when she served as translator with foreign guests or helped manage household administrative tasks. Khalid found himself increasingly aware of Maria's presence. Unlike the other staff who showed obsequious deference that felt transactional, Maria was respectful but carried herself with quiet dignity. She was educated beyond her station, speaking thoughtfully when asked questions, showing genuine care for his children when she interacted with them. Most intriguingly, she seemed almost immune to his wealth and status, treating them as unremarkable rather than constantly impressed, a refreshing contrast to both his status-conscious first wife and other domestic workers who fawned over everything. The courtship, if it could be called that, began in mid-2015 with increasingly personal conversations. Khalid would find reasons to speak with Maria about household matters, their discussions gradually encompassing her background, her family, her dreams. Maria, aware of the dangerous territory she was entering, tried to maintain professional distance. But the attention from a man with such power over her circumstances, combined with his growing generosity, gifts for her daughter, bonus payments, better accommodations, slowly eroded her resistance. By late 2015, Khalid had decided he wanted Maria as his second wife. In his cultural framework, this was both permissible and logical. Islamic law allowed 4 wives, she was unmarried as far as he knew, and marriage would regularize a relationship that he acknowledged was developing beyond employer-employee boundaries. He would provide for her generously, bring her daughter to the UAE, and give her status far beyond what she could achieve otherwise. In his mind, this was a generous offer that any rational woman in her position would eagerly accept. Maria's response was conflicted. Marriage to Khalid would provide Isabella with opportunities beyond anything Maria could offer otherwise: quality education, financial security, a life free from the poverty that had defined Maria's childhood. The offer included bringing Isabella to the UAE, providing her with the best schools, ensuring her future was secure. These weren't small considerations for a mother who'd sacrificed everything for her daughter's welfare. But Maria also understood the precariousness of her position. As a second wife to a Muslim man, she'd have some legal protections under Islamic law, but would always be subordinate to the first wife. She'd be economically dependent on Khalid's continued favor in a country where her visa status was entirely controlled by her husband. And accepting his proposal required perpetuating the lie about her marital history, a lie that felt increasingly dangerous the more serious their relationship became. When Khalid formally proposed in March 2016, presenting her with gold jewelry and promises of a good life for her and Isabella, Maria made the decision that would ultimately lead to her near death. She accepted while continuing to maintain that she'd never been married, that Isabella's father had died before they could formalize their relationship, and that she came to Khalid without any complicated past that might threaten their future together. The Islamic marriage contract was signed in April 2016 in a small ceremony attended by required witnesses and an imam who asked the standard questions about her marital status. Maria lied to religious authority, signed documents falsely, and became Sheikh Khalid's second wife based on a foundation of deception that felt justified by her desperate circumstances, but which violated both UAE law and Islamic principles her husband held sacred. The first year of Maria's marriage to Sheikh Khalid represented everything she'd desperately hoped for when she'd fled Manila: security, comfort, and most importantly, a future for Isabella that transcended the generational poverty that had defined their family. Isabella arrived in the UAE in June 2016. At 7 years old, transformed overnight from a child attending overcrowded public schools in Manila to a student at Al Ain's most exclusive international academy, where annual fees exceeded what Maria's father earned in 5 years. Maria's accommodations shifted from servants' quarters to a private villa within Khalid's compound, not his main residence with his first wife Fatima, but a separate 4-bedroom home with a garden, swimming pool, and staff of her own. She received a generous monthly allowance of 25,000 dirhams, a driver, a credit card with no preset limit, and access to the kind of material luxury that felt surreal after years of survival mode poverty. She sent substantial funds home to her family, who moved from Tondo to a decent house in Quezon City, her siblings' education finally secured, her parents' endless financial stress finally alleviated. But the golden cage was still a cage. Maria's life was controlled with absolute precision by Khalid, who viewed his generosity as purchasing the right to dictate every aspect of her existence. Her movements were monitored. The driver reported her locations, her spending was reviewed, her phone calls were subject to his inspection at any moment. She was expected to be available whenever Khalid desired her company, to maintain specific grooming standards, to behave with the demure modesty he considered appropriate for a Muslim wife despite her Catholic background. The relationship with Fatima, Khalid's first wife, was coldly civil at best. Fatima viewed Maria as a foreign interloper who'd seduced her husband despite the obvious power imbalance that made seduction a questionable characterization. Though Islamic law recognized Maria's marriage as legitimate, social reality was more complicated. Fatima's family was powerful and connected, her children were Khalid's heirs, and her position was secure in ways Maria's never could be. She made clear through 1,000 small cruelties that Maria was temporary, tolerated, but never truly accepted into the family. Khalid himself was a complicated man whose treatment of Maria cycled between genuine affection and controlling possessiveness that occasionally tipped into psychological abuse. He could be tender, bringing gifts from travels, playing with Isabella, speaking about their future together. But he could also be demanding and cold, reminding Maria through subtle and explicit means that everything she had, her villa, her daughter's education, her family's improved circumstances, existed entirely at his discretion and could be withdrawn if she displeased him. The sex was dutiful from Maria's perspective, an obligation she performed with enough enthusiasm to maintain his satisfaction, but without genuine desire. Khalid seemed not to notice or care about the performative nature of their physical relationship, viewing her compliance as appropriate wifely behavior. He spoke occasionally about her converting to Islam, framing it as a suggestion, but with undertones that made clear it was an expectation he'd eventually enforce. Isabella adjusted to her new circumstances with the adaptability of children, though Maria worried about the psychological impact of such dramatic transformation. Her daughter was learning Arabic, making friends with children from wealthy families, and beginning to take for granted luxuries that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. The distance growing between them, cultural, linguistic, experiential, frightened Maria even as she'd sacrificed everything to provide these opportunities. The lie about her past marriage haunted Maria constantly. She detold the story so many times it had taken on the quality of truth in her mind, but the fear of discovery never completely faded. She disposed of every document connecting her to Carlos, photos, the marriage certificate, anything that might expose her deception. She de-instructed her family never to mention her previous marriage to anyone, framing it as protecting Isabella from painful memories. She de-reconstructed her entire history to align with the fiction she'd created. But in late 2017, cracks began appearing in her carefully constructed narrative. One of the Filipino drivers, new to Khalid's household, mentioned casually that he'd grown up near Tondo and thought he recognized Maria's family name from the neighborhood. Though the conversation was innocent, it triggered paranoia in Maria. If someone from her past appeared in Al Ain, if the wrong person asked the right questions, if any document from her previous life surfaced, the entire structure of her new existence would collapse. Her anxiety manifested in physical symptoms: insomnia, weight loss, stomach problems that doctors attributed to stress but couldn't specifically diagnose. Khalid noticed her increasing nervousness, interpreting it as adjustment difficulties or homesickness rather than the terror of someone living under a false identity. He responded with both tenderness and suspicion, occasionally asking probing questions about her past that Maria deflected with practiced vagueness. The confrontation that would lead to Maria's near death began with a phone call in January 2018. Khalid's business dealings occasionally required background checks on associates and employees, services provided by investigation firms with international reach. For reasons Maria never fully understood, whether triggered by genuine suspicion or routine due diligence on his foreign wife, Khalid hired one of these firms to conduct a comprehensive background investigation on Maria Elena Santos. The investigators were thorough, accessing Philippine databases, interviewing people from Maria's past, and reconstructing her actual history with the meticulous detail that money could purchase. They found the marriage certificate from Manila City Hall. They located Carlos Reyes, now remarried but willing to confirm his previous marriage to Maria for the right price. They documented Isabella's birth certificate listing Carlos as father, a document that contradicted Maria's story about an unmarried boyfriend who died. They compiled police reports from Maria's hospitalization after domestic violence, establishing a pattern of abuse, but also proving the marriage Maria had denied existed. The report arrived on Khalid's desk in March 2018, a comprehensive file that exposed every lie Maria had told over the past 5 years. She was not single when they met. She had not been widowed. Her daughter was not the product of an unmarried relationship, but of a legal marriage that had ended in violence and abandonment. She had lied to him, to religious authorities, and on every official document, committing fraud that invalidated their marriage contract under both Islamic and UAE civil law. For a man whose identity was built on concepts of honor, family reputation, and absolute honesty in domestic relationships, the betrayal was complete. Khalid hadn't just been deceived. He'd been made a fool, tricked into a marriage that was legally questionable and religiously invalid. His family would be humiliated if this became known. His first wife would gain leverage in their household dynamics. The respect he commanded in his social circle would be undermined by the revelation that he'd been manipulated by a domestic worker. The confrontation happened on the evening of March 23, 2018. Khalid summoned Maria to the main villa's study, a formal space where he conducted business, his expression carrying the cold fury she'd never seen directed at her before. The investigation report lay open on his desk, its contents devastating in their comprehensiveness. Isabella was at her evening study session, unaware that her mother's world was about to detonate. "Sit," Khalid commanded, his voice devoid of the affection that usually softened his authority. Maria sat, her hands shaking, knowing before he spoke that everything was over. "Were you married before?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like a death sentence. Maria's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The lie she'd maintained for 5 years couldn't be spoken again, not with evidence staring at her from his desk. But confession meant destruction of everything she'd built. "Answer me," Khalid's voice rose, the first time he'd ever truly yelled at her. "Were you married to Carlos Reyes? Is your entire story a lie?" The confession poured out between sobs. The early marriage, the violence, her flight with Isabella, the impossible choice between honesty that would cost her the UAE opportunity and deception that might provide security. She begged him to understand the desperation that drove her choices, the circumstances that made lying seem like survival rather than fraud. Khalid listened with an expression that shifted from fury to disgust. When she finished, he stood and walked to the window overlooking his compound, his back to her while he processed the magnitude of deception. "You made me complicit in fraud," he said finally, his voice controlled but shaking with rage. "Our marriage is invalid under Islamic law. You were married to another man when we signed our contract. You lied to the imam, to officials, to me. You've humiliated me and dishonored my family with your deception." "I'm sorry," Maria whispered, the words completely inadequate. "I was desperate. I needed to protect Isabella. I was afraid." "Your fear doesn't justify making a fool of me," Khalid interrupted. "Do you understand what happens now? This marriage is void. You've committed fraud that could result in criminal charges. Your visa was obtained through false pretenses. Everything you have here was built on lies." The threat hung between them: deportation, prosecution, loss of Isabella's schooling and future, return to the poverty and danger she'd fled. Maria fell to her knees, literally begging for mercy, for a chance to make it right, for consideration of the years she'd been a faithful wife despite the lie that began their relationship. Khalid's response was cold and final. "You will leave this house tonight. Isabella will remain here until I decide what happens with her. The education, the opportunities I've provided don't disappear because her mother is a liar and a fraud. You will return to the servants' quarters while I consult with my family and legal advisors about how to handle this situation with minimal damage to my reputation." "Please don't take Isabella," Maria begged, the one fear greater than all others suddenly real. "She's my daughter. She needs me. Whatever you do to me, please don't punish her." "She's better off without a mother who teaches her that deception and lies are acceptable," Khalid replied. "You'll see her when I decide you've earned that privilege. Now get out of my sight." Maria was escorted by security back to the servants' quarters, her villa locked behind her, her belongings packed and removed, while she was forbidden from taking anything beyond basic clothing. She spent the night in a small room, no longer the honored second wife, but demoted to disgraced employee pending decisions about her fate. Over the following 3 days, Maria existed in a hell of uncertainty. She was forbidden from contacting Isabella, who'd been told her mother was ill and staying elsewhere. She had no access to money, her phone was confiscated, and her movements were restricted to the servants' area. She learned through whispered conversations with sympathetic Filipino staff that Khalid was meeting with family members and legal counsel, discussing options that ranged from quiet deportation to formal criminal charges that could result in imprisonment before deportation. The worst torture was not knowing Isabella's welfare. Was her daughter scared? Did she understand what was happening? Would Khalid turn her against Maria, poison their relationship with justifications for his actions? The separation was agony, made worse by Maria's awareness that she'd brought this on herself through deception that had seemed necessary, but now felt unforgivably reckless. On March 26th, Khalid's brother Abdullah appeared at the servants' quarters with a proposition that was really an ultimatum. The family had decided that criminal prosecution would attract publicity they didn't want. Instead, Maria would sign documents agreeing to an immediate divorce, relinquishing any claim to assets or support. She would be deported within 48 hours. And most devastatingly, she would sign over temporary custody of Isabella to Khalid, allowing him to continue her education in the UAE for a period of 2 years, after which her future would be reassessed. "You're taking my daughter," Maria said, the words barely audible. "We're providing her with opportunities you never could," Abdullah replied. "She'll have the best education, complete financial security, and a future that your lies nearly destroyed. In 2 years, if you've proven yourself stable and capable back in the Philippines, we'll discuss her returning to you. But right now, you've demonstrated that you're not fit to make decisions in her best interest." The documents were placed before her with a pen. Sign or face criminal prosecution that would result in imprisonment, deportation, and permanent separation from Isabella anyway. The choice wasn't really a choice. Maria signed, each stroke of the pen feeling like cutting away pieces of her soul. She was given 1 hour to pack her minimal belongings and say goodbye to Isabella under supervised conditions that made genuine conversation impossible. Her daughter, confused and crying, clung to her while Maria tried to explain through tears that she'd be back soon, that this was temporary, that everything would be okay. Lies again, different from the ones that destroyed her marriage, but lies nonetheless. That evening, March 26, 2018, Maria was placed in a car supposedly heading to Abu Dhabi airport for her deportation flight. But the driver didn't head toward the highway. Instead, he drove deep into the desert surrounding Al Ain, following unmarked tracks between dunes while Maria, sedated with something she'd been forced to drink, drifted in and out of consciousness. When Maria regained full consciousness, she was in hell. The car was gone, replaced by vast emptiness of desert in every direction. The sun was setting, painting the sand in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if they weren't the backdrop for her murder. And Khalid stood before her, flanked by 2 men she recognized as his personal security, their expressions showing the flat affect of people prepared to commit violence on command. "Did you really think I'd let you leave with your lies unpunished?" Khalid asked, his voice carrying a rage barely controlled. "That I'd just send you home while you laughed about how you deceived a sheikh, how you made a fool of me and my family?" Maria tried to speak, but her mouth was too dry, her body still affected by whatever they'd drugged her with. Terror flooded her system as she realized this wasn't deportation, this was execution. In the old days, before law and civilization made us weak, women who dishonored their husbands were dealt with according to tribal justice, Khalid continued. "You've dishonored me, my family, and Islamic principles. You took advantage of my generosity and repaid it with lies. That deserves punishment that law can't provide." The men grabbed her arms, dragging her 50 meters from where the vehicles were parked to a location between dunes that seemed chosen for its isolation. A hole had been dug, roughly 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep, a grave prepared for someone meant to die slowly rather than quickly. They forced Maria into the hole, her screams swallowed by desert vastness where no one would hear or help. "You will stay here until you understand the consequence of deception," Khalid said, standing over her while his men began shoveling sand over her body. "Until you've had time to reflect on how your lies destroyed everything. Maybe the desert will teach you truth." The sand came in waves, covering her legs, her torso, burying her arms that tried futilely to push it away. They left her head exposed, ensuring she wouldn't die immediately but would suffer the full psychological torment of being buried alive. The physical weight of sand compressed her chest, making breathing difficult. The heat still radiating from the day-warmed sand scorched her skin. But the psychological horror, the absolute helplessness, the certainty of slow death, was more devastating than any physical pain. "Someone will find you eventually," Khalid said, his voice carrying a cruelty she'd never imagined from the man who'd spoken so gently to her over the past 2 years. "Or they won't. Either way, you'll die knowing that your lies led to this, that your daughter will grow up believing her mother abandoned her, not knowing you died because you couldn't tell the truth." They left her there as the sun completed its descent, and desert night brought temperature drop from scorching to freezing. Maria could move her head, could see stars appearing in vast darkness, could scream though her voice carried nowhere. The sand's weight made breathing increasingly difficult with each hour. Dehydration set in rapidly. Panic came in waves, followed by periods of dissociation where her mind tried to escape the reality her body couldn't flee. She prayed to God, to any power that might intervene, bargaining and begging for rescue that seemed impossible in this emptiness. She thought about Isabella, hoping desperately that her daughter would remember her mother's love rather than just the abandonment it would appear to be. She thought about her family in Manila, who'd never know what happened to her, who'd believe she'd simply disappeared into the Gulf the way many migrant workers did, swallowed by circumstances that left no trace. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. The cold of desert night made her shiver violently despite the sand's insulation. Her lips cracked and bled from dehydration. Her throat was too dry to produce sound anymore. She drifted in and out of consciousness, unsure which state was preferable, awareness of her situation or the brief escape of unconsciousness. The rescue, when it came, was accidental and miraculous. A Bedouin family traveling between tribal lands spotted tire tracks that seemed unusual for that area, investigated out of curiosity, and found Maria barely alive at dawn on March 27th. The family patriarch, Mohammed bin Salem, immediately recognized this as attempted murder rather than an unfortunate accident. He called police while his wife tried to provide water and comfort to a woman so dehydrated she couldn't initially speak. The response by UAE authorities was swift and comprehensive. The location, the tire tracks, the obvious signs of premeditation, all pointed to attempted murder. The investigation reached Khalid within hours, his involvement proven by testimony from his employees who'd been promised money for silence but broke under police questioning. The men who dug the grave and buried Maria were arrested at Khalid's compound. Security footage from the villa showed Maria being forced into a vehicle. Her signed divorce documents were revealed to be coerced under duress and threat. Khalid's arrest sent shockwaves through Al Ain's elite community. A sheikh had attempted to murder his foreign wife, had committed crimes that couldn't be covered up or smoothed over through family connections. The case became international news, with Philippine authorities demanding justice for their citizen, human rights organizations highlighting the vulnerability of migrant workers, and UAE officials facing pressure to prove their legal system protected everyone regardless of status. Maria's hospitalization lasted 3 weeks. She'd suffered severe dehydration, heat exposure, compression injuries from the sand's weight, and psychological trauma that would require years of therapy to process. Her body recovered faster than her mind, the physical injuries treatable while the psychological scars remained raw and debilitating. She woke screaming from nightmares of suffocation, couldn't tolerate enclosed spaces, and experienced panic attacks triggered by unexpected sounds or movements. Isabella was returned to Maria's care immediately, placed in protective custody while investigations continued. Their reunion was tearful and complicated. Isabella had been told conflicting stories about her mother's absence, didn't fully understand what had happened, and struggled to reconcile the mother she knew with the traumatized woman in the hospital bed. Child psychologists worked with both of them, helping Isabella process the trauma while helping Maria rebuild their relationship despite the interrupted weeks. The trial of Sheikh Khalid bin Abdullah al-Mazroui began in September 2018 and lasted 4 months. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of premeditated attempted murder. The investigation report that triggered his rage, testimony from staff about his statements regarding tribal justice, the physical evidence from the desert burial site, and most damningly, security footage and witness accounts of Maria being forcibly taken from the compound. Khalid's defense team pursued multiple strategies. They argued temporary insanity triggered by the humiliation of discovering his wife's lies. They attempted to introduce Maria's fraudulent documents as justification for extreme emotional distress. They suggested cultural misunderstanding, claiming his intent was to frighten rather than kill her. They even tried to invoke Islamic principles regarding punishment for deception within marriage, arguments the prosecution dismantled by noting that Islamic law provided religious divorce remedies, not extrajudicial execution. The cultural complexities of the case created tensions that exposed uncomfortable truths about the UAE's treatment of foreign workers. Maria's initial deception about her marital status was technically fraudulent, raising questions about her own culpability in creating the situation. Conservative voices argued that her lies justified Khalid's anger, if not his actions. But human rights advocates countered that desperation-driven document fraud by migrant workers was survival behavior in systems that provided no legal pathways for complicated situations, and that regardless of her deception, attempted murder was never justified. Testimony from domestic violence experts contextualized Maria's original lies, explaining how abuse survivors often resort to deception to escape dangerous situations and protect their children. The Philippine government provided documentation of the abuse Maria had suffered from Carlos, the hospital records from her injuries, the complete absence of legal resources that would have allowed her to properly divorce and document her status. Her lies were framed not as malicious deception, but as desperate attempts to escape poverty and violence through the only pathway available. The verdict delivered in January 2019 was guilty on all charges: attempted murder, kidnapping, assault, and abuse of power. Khalid was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, a landmark ruling that sent clear messages about the UAE's commitment to protecting foreign workers regardless of the social status of perpetrators. His assets were frozen pending civil litigation. His first wife, Fatima, immediately divorced him to protect family wealth and reputation. His children from that marriage were left to process the horror of their father's actions. The civil case resulted in substantial compensation for Maria, 5 million dirhams for her suffering, trauma, and the ongoing psychological treatment she'd require. The money was secured through Khalid's frozen assets, ensuring payment regardless of his family's attempts to protect their wealth. The Philippine government arranged for Maria and Isabella's safe return to Manila in March 2019, exactly 1 year after the attempted murder, with diplomatic protections and guarantees of ongoing support. Maria's return to the Philippines was complicated by fame she hadn't sought. Her case had been international news, making her recognizable and subject to public opinion that ranged from sympathetic to judgmental. Some praised her survival and bravery. Others condemned her original lies, viewing her suffering as karmic consequence. The complexity of her story, simultaneously victim and deceiver, made her an uncomfortable figure who didn't fit neatly into heroic or cautionary narratives. She used her compensation to purchase a home in Quezon City, enroll Isabella in a quality private school, and establish a small business providing employment training for women. But the trauma never fully healed. Maria struggled with PTSD, trust issues, and survivors' guilt about the other Filipino workers still enduring exploitation in Gulf countries. She became an advocate for migrant worker rights, sharing her story at conferences and in media interviews, warning about the particular vulnerabilities faced by women who felt they must lie to access opportunities. Isabella, now 11 years old, carried her own trauma from the experience: the luxury then sudden deprivation, the separation from her mother, the revelation of violence at the core of their circumstances. She struggled in school, processing the dramatic changes in her life, eventually finding stability through therapy and her mother's dedication to rebuilding their relationship. Their bond, tested by deception and violence, ultimately strengthened through the process of healing together. Carlos Reyes, Maria's first husband, attempted to contact her after the trial, claiming he deserved some of the compensation since their marriage had been the source of her problems. Maria obtained a restraining order, finally pursuing the legal divorce she should have secured years earlier, officially ending the marriage that had caused so much suffering. Carlos's attempts to profit from her trauma became another reminder that some people never change. The broader impact of Maria's case led to reforms in UAE labor law, providing clearer pathways for migrant workers to report abuse without fear of immediate visa cancellation. Protections for domestic workers were strengthened, penalties for employers who abused their power were increased, and screening processes for marriage applications became more nuanced to account for abuse survivors, whose complicated backgrounds resulted from victimization rather than malicious deception. The questions Maria's story raises remain complex and resistant to simple answers. What responsibility do desperate people bear for lies told to escape violence and poverty? How do we balance the need for honest documentation with recognition that legal systems often fail those most vulnerable? Where is the line between justified anger at deception and unforgivable violence in response? These questions don't have easy answers, but Maria's near death forces us to confront them. 5 years after her rescue from the desert, Maria continues rebuilding her life in Manila. The psychological scars remain. She still has nightmares, still struggles with trust, still carries the weight of decisions made in desperation that nearly cost her everything. But she's alive. Isabella is thriving in her teenage years, considering a future in social work to help others navigating the systems that failed her mother. And Maria's advocacy work has contributed to protecting other migrant workers from similar exploitation. Sheikh Khalid bin Abdullah al-Mazroui remains in prison, his early release petitions repeatedly denied. His family has distanced themselves completely. His children have taken their mother's maiden name, and his wealth has been distributed among creditors and victims of his actions. The man who believed his honor required burying a woman alive learned that real honor comes from accountability rather than violence, a lesson that came too late to undo the harm he caused. Maria's story is not a fairy tale with tidy resolution. It's a tragedy narrowly averted, a life saved by miraculous timing, and a reminder that the most dangerous predators often hide behind the facade of respectability and wealth. Her survival doesn't erase the trauma. The justice she received doesn't fully compensate for the suffering, but her voice, raised to warn and protect others, transforms her victimization into advocacy that might spare others from similar fates. May her courage in speaking truth after years of necessary lies inspire systems to create pathways where truth-telling doesn't require risking everything. May her survival remind us that no deception, however frustrating or offensive, justifies violence. And may we build a world where women like Maria Santos never again face the impossible choice between dangerous honesty and protective lies in their fight for basic dignity and survival.